The following accounts originally appeared in Tales from the Crypts of Auld Reekie, a brilliant book put together by my friend John Tantalon. The book's filled with strange and often frightening accounts from Edinburgh's shadowy corners, with contributions from Graeme Milne, Kerrie Powell, Scott Lyal and Joss Cameron. When John invited me to contribute a chapter, I chose a street that, tranquil as it seems, may be one of the most haunted in all of Edinburgh. Tales from the Crypts of Auld Reekie is available now on Amazon if you'd like to explore the full collection. When people think of Edinburgh's ghost stories, their minds usually jump straight to the Old Town, and that's with good reason. From the silhouette of the castle down to the gates of Holyrood, this stretch of the city has seen centuries of life, death, and everything in between. It became a kind of shorthand for the haunted, packed with towering tenements, narrow closes, and a gloom that seems to hang in the air, even on the brightest days. Stories of satanic wizards, haunted closes, and hidden underground vaults have captured the public's imagination for decades. The Mackenzie Poltergeist at Greyfriars is one of the most famous modern hauntings in the world, with thousands of visitors every year hoping to catch a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary. But ghost stories aren't just confined to the Old Town. If you head south, across the Meadows, past Brunsfield Links, and into the heart of Marchmont, you'll find a different side of the city, quieter, residential, but no less haunted. Because here, on a street best known for fictional detectives and sandstone flats, something strange has been happening for decades. Marchmont is an open, leafy part of the city that doesn't usually feature on the ghost tour maps. It's known for its tall tenement blocks, mostly built in the 1870s and 1880s, and many of them still carry the decorative flair of the Scots baronial style. Turrets, gables and carved stone details that hint at a different era. Today, Marchmont's a popular spot, home to a mix of older residents, students and young professionals. It wasn't always there though. Back in the mid-19th century, this part of the city was still part of the Warrender Park estate, owned by Sir George Warrender. As Edinburgh's population grew, so did the pressure for new housing. In 1869, architect David Bryce proposed a detailed plan for a middle-class suburb, mostly terraces, with a few larger villas along Marchmont Road. And what rose from those plans would eventually become the Marchmont we know today. Among its streets, one in particular stands out to me. Arden Street, a broad, cobbled road lined with old stone flats. These days it's probably best known as the fictional home of Inspector Rebus, but for some who lived there, it's remembered for something far stranger. Dutch and Flemish Renaissance paintings may not seem like a suitable subject for a chapter focused on eerie events, but it features heavily in our first story from the 1990s. This unusual and frightening encounter was relayed to me by a former resident of the street, whom we'll call John. John lived in a large main-door flat in Arden Street from the late 1980s to the early 2000s. If you're unfamiliar with that term, a main-door flat is a residential property, typically an apartment or flat located on the ground floor of a building with its own private entrance directly from the street, distinguishing it from flats accessed through a communal entrance. John's parents bought the property in the early 1980s when he was young, and he moved in when they relocated back to the Highlands, going on to study art at Edinburgh University. The property layout included a large main bedroom with a bay window on the right of the main door, where John slept, and a spare bedroom on the left, with a smaller box room adjacent to John's room. The bathroom was situated at the end of a long, dark hallway that was illuminated by a small window above the main door, and the frosted bathroom window at the other end. The kitchen, serving as both the kitchen and living room, was the third room on the right. This room featured a door leading to the back garden and a skylight that brought natural light into a small box room. As with a typical Edinburgh period home, the rooms were large, light, and with high ceilings. Despite living there for a large chunk of his life, the flat never quite felt like home. John always sensed something was off, a strange heaviness that hung in the air. He'd joke with friends that it felt like the devil was walking up and down the hallway, trying to brush it all off with humour. But deep down, he didn't find it funny. Even when the place was quiet, he never truly felt alone. At night, as darkness settled through the flat, that feeling only grew stronger. John had always been a sound sleeper, but now and then, something would wake him. He couldn't explain it at first. It was just like a shift in the air, a feeling, and the creeping sense that someone, or something, was moving along the same hallway he used to joke about. He'd lie there, heart thudding, convinced he'd heard slow, deliberate footsteps making their way along the hallway. But when he finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and take a look, there was nothing. Just silence, and the long, dark, seemingly endless corridor stretching out before him. He never found an explanation, but the feeling didn't go away, and after a while, living alone in that flat started to wear on him. So eventually John decided to bring in a flatmate to help with the cost of keeping a 3-bedroom place on his own, and, perhaps, for added sense of security. As time went on, John got to know some of the neighbours, and the more they warmed to him, the more they opened up, sharing stories that didn't appear in any Edinburgh ghost books. And there was one in particular that stayed with him. It was about another house on Arden Street, just a few doors away, and something that had reportedly happened back there in the 1960s. A student had been living alone in the flat at the time, and he was serious about his studies. He was quiet, focused, not the kind of person to make things up. And yet almost every day he'd hear the same thing: piano music. It wasn't loud. In fact, that was part of what made it so strange. It drifted in softly, like it was coming through a wall that wasn't really there. The melodies were delicate, beautiful, but unfamiliar, not modern. He couldn't place the composer, but it felt old, like something from the 1800s. It felt like someone in the next room was performing a private concert from another time. At first he thought it must be a neighbour, someone in the building with a love of classical music, but every time he tried to track it down, he hit a dead end. The sound never got louder or fainter. It didn't seem to come from above, below, or next door. It was always just there, hanging in the air, always at the same volume, no matter where he stood. Eventually he stopped trying to find it, and instead he came to accept it, almost welcome it. The way he described it, it felt like the music was meant for him, as if someone, somewhere, wanted to be heard. And the story of the phantom piano stuck with John, especially on nights when the flat felt too quiet. He started to wonder if what he was feeling wasn't just in his head. And he wasn't the only one. Friends sometimes mentioned the atmosphere, not always directly, but in passing. Some would hang back in the kitchen rather than walk down the hall alone. Others asked if someone else was home when they knew it was just the two of them. Most described the same thing, the strange sense you get when you're being watched, and it was strongest in the hallway. In the summer of 1998, a flatmate moved in. We'll call him James. He took the small box room just off the corridor, and before long, he too started to feel it. He didn't like the hallway, said it felt charged, like something was waiting just out of view. And sometimes, late at night, he'd hear footsteps pacing slowly outside his door. But when he opened it, just as with John, there was nothing. Just the same long corridor, stretching away in silence. Then things started to move around. Small things at first. A book he'd left on the bed would turn up in another room. Objects would vanish and reappear days later. It never felt threatening, but it didn't feel right either. Eventually he started leaving the lights on overnight, just in case. On one occasion, after showering and popping out to the local shop, he returned to find a towel. The towel he'd just dried himself down with and left on the radiator in the bathroom was wrapped around an ornate wall light in his room. No one else was in the property at the time. James had locked the main door on the way out, and the door to his room was shut when he left, and still shut when he returned. Moments like that worried him, but they also fed into something deeper. John was an art student, and he had a long fascination with dark imagery, especially in the work of the Dutch and Flemish masters. One painter in particular stood out to him, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Bruegel lived in the 16th century and is widely considered to be one of the greatest painters of his era. He had 2 sons who became artists as well, but it was the father's work, especially his more disturbing pieces, that really drew John in. Not just The Hunters in the Snow, which most people recognise, but the bleaker stuff, The Triumph of Death, The Massacre of the Innocents, and his eerie allegories of sin and suffering. John found the detail hypnotic, entire worlds of chaos and symbolism unfolding in a single frame. It wasn't just academic interest. Something about those paintings spoke to him. One of John's most prized possessions was a large art book, a collection of prints focused on the darker works of Bruegel. Paintings, etchings, sketches, all bound together in one heavy volume. He can't quite remember the title now, but he thinks it was something like the Bruegel Book of Etchings. It sat beside his bed in the Edinburgh Press, not just for study, but because it meant something to him. A kind of window into a world he found both disturbing and mesmerising. He'd flipped through it often, especially the grimmer pieces. The Triumph of Death, The Massacre of the Innocents, The 7 Deadly Sins. Scenes full of movement and chaos, each corner packed with tiny, unsettling details. For John, it wasn't morbid curiosity, it was fascination. These weren't just paintings, they felt like warnings, messages buried in allegory. And then came the morning he still can't explain. It was winter, the kind of morning where the sky stays black well past 8 a.m, and the cold seems to sink into the stone of the building. He hadn't slept badly. Nothing felt unusual, until he opened his eyes. The room was quiet and still in darkness. The heavy curtains were drawn tight. Reaching for the small light next to his bed, he flicked it on, and saw something strange. The floor. It wasn't the usual stretch of carpet. It was covered in loose sheets of paper, dozens of them, scattered from edge to edge. Confused, he leaned down and picked one up. It was a print from the Bruegel book. It wasn't just any image, it was Dull Gret or Mad Meg. The one where a furious woman leads a band of women into the mouth of hell, storming it with weapons in hand. The rest were the same, Bruegel prints, all of them, all from that same book. John stared at the floor, trying to make sense of it. The pages weren't torn. Each one had been carefully removed, as if someone or something had taken the time to do it methodically. He sat up on the edge of his bed, trying to steady his thoughts. Maybe he'd done it himself, maybe in his sleep, but he'd never sleepwalked before. And there was a darker thought too, that someone had come into the flat while he slept. So he got up, checked the doors and windows, all locked. No sign of a break-in, nothing moved, nothing out of place, except for what was now covering the floor of his room. He gathered the prints up one by one, still not sure what to think, and to this day, he still doesn't. Edinburgh's Meadows have long been a favourite spot for dog walkers. A wide open stretch of green just north of Arden Street, where you'll often see dogs bounding across the grass, tails wagging, chasing balls and enjoying the kind of simple joy they're so good at. There's something comforting about that scene. The bond between people and dogs, loyal, familiar and steady. But in the mid-1980s, one woman experienced something very different. We'll call her Eerie. She was a student at the time, sharing a flat on Arden Street with a few friends, and for a while everything was fine. Until one night, while she was sleeping, she was woken by the sound of something moving in her room. It was soft, rhythmic, the unmistakable sound of a dog's paws on a wooden floor. She reached for the bedside lamp, half expecting to see a dog standing by the bed, but when the light came on, the room was empty. At first she put it down to a dream, maybe something half remembered from the day before. But it happened again and again. And then came the night she was fully awake when it started. She lay frozen as the sound began, paws moving across the floorboards, circling the room. She looked around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. And then things escalated. Eerie began waking in the night to a strange weight pressing down on her, like something was lying on top of her chest. Each time it happened, she'd open her eyes and see the same thing, a border collie, standing on her chest, looking directly at her. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, she just watched as the dog slowly faded from view. It never stayed long, a few seconds, maybe more, but it left her shaken for hours afterwards. She never found a reason for what happened. She has no history of sleep paralysis, and no known haunting is tied to the flat, but the experiences felt real, too specific, too physical to ignore. When she'd finished her studies, Eerie left Edinburgh for Glasgow, but she's never forgotten that flat, and she's never doubted what she saw, a ghostly dog returning night after night, as if still waiting for someone. When many of us reminisce about childhood, the anticipation of staying with grandparents felt like discovering a treasure trove of joy, safety, and unwavering comfort. These visits were a haven where rules felt a tad more forgiving, treats a touch sweeter, and the warmth of family love cocooned you in a comforting embrace. Laughter echoed off the walls, and the kitchen bore the comforting scent of home-cooked meals, creating an environment where every moment unfolded as a cherished adventure. Little did one young girl know that behind this seemingly idyllic facade lurked a mysterious and haunting reality, just waiting to be unveiled. This story happened just a few doors along from John's encounter, and it began a decade or so before. As with her first tale, the lady who contacted me asked for anonymity, so we'll call her Iona. Iona's grandparents settled in Arden Street during the mid-1960s, when Marchmont predominantly housed elderly residents, drawn to its central location and tranquil atmosphere. The property they now called home was, like John's, a main door flat, with an identical layout. The bedrooms were to the left and the right of the main door, with the bathroom at the end of the entrance hall, plus access to a front and back garden. Iona's memories of her grandparents' home were of a tidy, welcoming, and fun homestead during the day. But as night fell and darkness draped its cloak over the street, the once inviting surroundings transformed into a realm of terror and trepidation. During her stays, Iona's bedroom was the room to the right of the main door, the very room where John in his own property slept, and just like John, Iona experienced events that left her fearing the moment the lights went off. As with many similar encounters, Iona's haunting started with intangible unease, settling into the corners of her consciousness. There were inexplicable moments of discomfort, a subtle chill that permeated the air in certain rooms, leaving her wary and watchful without a discernible cause. The once familiar spaces began to harbour a silent disquiet, and being alone in a room triggered a primal panic, an unsettling feeling that grew from the unseen and unexplained. Iona's grandmother was an early riser, and she'd often find Iona fast asleep on the dining room floor, far from her own room. When asked why she chose such an unconventional sleeping spot, Iona, being very young at the time, could only express that she didn't like her room and felt scared, so found comfort in sleeping elsewhere. The nights unfolded and the cause behind her nocturnal wanderings evolved from vague feelings to something profoundly disconcerting. Soon the source of Iona's apprehension in a room would come to light, transforming her initial cautiousness into a palpable and unsettling reality. Yet the ghostly secret hiding within her grandparents' home remained shrouded, anticipating the moment when Iona would confront it head-on. One night, roused from her slumber, Iona found herself in the grip of wakefulness, only to behold the disturbing apparition of an old-fashioned, well-dressed man within her bedroom. As she slowly opened her eyes, still clouded by the remnants of sleep, she rubbed them and squinted, struggling to comprehend the surreal sight before her. A spectral figure, impeccably attired, holding a newspaper and gazing directly at her. Convinced this was a product of her dreams, she tried her best to go back to sleep. However, as the years passed and she encountered this figure repeatedly, it became clear it wasn't merely a fleeting dream, but a permanent presence in her night. As frightening as the apparition proved to be, a more distressing development awaited. A few years after her initial encounter, Iona's room was relocated to the box room, adjacent to the main bedroom, which was now repurposed as a sitting room. This room change would unlock a new fear. Reportedly, she sensed an ominous presence just beyond the box room. Night after night, Iona felt this unseen entity standing directly outside, as if patiently waiting. Terrified of the unknown lurking behind her door, she frequently endured uneasy nights, refraining from using the bathroom at the end of the hallway. On those nights where she mustered enough courage, she would opt for the door leading to the sitting room, avoiding the need to open her own door, and quickly make her way to the bathroom. Iona would describe the visitor as a real nasty presence, quite menacing and really quite terrifying. It seemed to enjoy my fear and, I believe, was even fed by it. Beyond this unsettling undertone, She frequently caught the distinct creak of floorboards outside her door, almost as if someone, or something, was engaged in a slow, measured pacing up and down the hallway, reminiscent of John's subsequent experience in his own property. Over the years, as Iona grew up, her chosen path took her away from Edinburgh. Though she saw her grandparents during this period, several years elapsed before she returned to stay in Arden Street. And upon her return in the late 1980s, she discovered that the disconcerting feelings she'd experienced beforehand hadn't dissipated, nor had the ominous presence. The night she spent there would be a night she would never forget. I went to sleep that night with the lights off. Suddenly, and very forcefully, the lock on my door, which had a number of keyrings on, started to shake violently. Then the door flew open with force. I was absolutely petrified. I couldn't switch the light on as I was frozen with fear. This proved to be one of the last occasions Iona would stay there, as her grandparents moved out in the mid-1990s. In reflecting on the years since, Iona often contemplates the nature of the presence she encountered, leading her to conclude, "I've always had the feeling that he was very old, and may have been a lot older than when the flats were constructed, but who knows?" Could Iona be correct? Could whatever haunts the buildings of Arden Street be something that predates them, something more ancient, something tied to the land, or an event that happened there before construction began? Modern-day Edinburgh has been inhabited for thousands of years, and the area around Arden Street, once part of the Borough Muir, is no stranger to that long and sometimes brutal history. Back then, this stretch of land was dense forest, a place where Scottish armies gathered before going to war, including those sent to fight at Flodden in 1513. Later, it became a place to isolate the sick during plague outbreaks, somewhere people were sent, but didn't always return. It's a part of the city where the past feels close, and just down the road at Gillespie Crescent, there was once a house called the Wright House. It's gone now, demolished years ago, but before it came down, it was said to be haunted by the headless ghost of a mother and child. Their bodies were found hidden under the floorboards in a makeshift coffin, too small to fit them both. The mother had been decapitated. So while Arden Street may seem relatively modern, the ground beneath it's known heartbreak, violence and death for centuries. Is that what's behind these hauntings? Or could it be something stranger? Some believe certain places act as portals, thin spots in the fabric of the world, where other realms bleed through. You'll find stories like that all over the world. There's the Hellfire Caves in England, linked to ritual, secrecy, and a lingering presence that people still claim to feel underground. There's the infamous Skinwalker Ranch in the US, with reports of ghosts, creatures, and strange lights all tangled together in one place. And then there's the RMS Queen Mary, a retired ocean liner now docked in California. It's been called one of the most haunted locations in America, with dozens of separate ghost sightings. But some investigators think it's more than that something on board is drawing those spirits in, that a kind of portal might exist deep within the ship, where time and space blur. Edinburgh may already have a few places like that, the Royal Mile, the Vaults, and maybe Arden Street deserves to be added to that list. I don't know for sure, but I do wonder.